Help. Just having a look at some of the comments from the quote. There was a lovely one from Sonia who wrote, "Ambiguities are just another pandemic," which I think is a lovely idea. Hopefully, I can persuade you during today's talk of how wonderful ambiguity is to the learning process, but it is certainly an uncomfortable one. Right, let's see. So for today, the session today is called "Is that the right answer?" And what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be looking at questions. We're going to be thinking about the questions that we ask as teachers. We're going to be thinking about the questions that we are asked by our learners. And in particular, we're going to explore a little bit about how we deal with those questions, especially when we consider the idea of ambiguity, which, as I think I'll repeat several times, ambiguity is so important to the learning cycle, but it is something that makes us feel uncomfortable. So how do we reconcile that something that makes us feel uncomfortable is actually good for us? And those are some of the areas that we'll explore today. So this is a quick running order. I'm going to be talking for around 30 minutes. And as Neil said, if you have any questions, any thoughts, any ideas, any suggestions, or you just want to shout at me, by all means do, but save it till the end and we'll have a chance at the end to ask any questions. We're going to look a little bit about questions, how they work within the learning cycle. We're going to think about the questions that we ask as teachers in the classroom and the questions that we are asked by our students and how we deal with those questions. Then we're going to look at the idea of ambiguity, explore what ambiguity is, how children relate to ambiguity, and what ambiguity means within the learning cycle. Okay. Now, I should say I'm using a standing desk. So, and I'm very tempted to just kind of move out of the picture. So I will do my best to not jump around too much and to keep still. Right, so let's start. First one, questions. And we're going to start with something that is probably very familiar to you from your teacher training days, Piaget's learning cycle. As you know, whenever we have a new idea, a new thought, we receive a new piece of information, that puts us in a state of disequilibrium. Something where we feel slightly unbalanced. From that point, we might ask ourselves a question, and based on the response to that question, we then adjust the new information so that it's either assimilated or accommodated into the schemas that we have. From there, we go in, we test that new information, and we start a new learning cycle. But as it suggests, that state of disequilibrium or cognitive dissonance, as it's also been called, it is something that makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable and it is a little bit frustrating, but it is a key part of the learning cycle. Now, at the moment, we've had a lot of reality, way too much reality, and I apologize for reminding us of the reality that we're all living in at the moment, but it is a great example. Because at the moment, when we got the information that we had to stay at home, it sounds really easy. It sounds very obvious. Stay at home, nice and simple. But then as soon as we get that information, we start asking more questions to say, okay, so can I go out shopping? Well, I can buy food. Can I go out for exercise? Well, in the UK, yes, I can. Can I take the dog out for a walk? Yes, I can. Can I go and get a coffee? No, I can't. So we're constantly, during this process, we were asking ourselves lots and lots of questions of what it means to actually stay at home. And as this lockdown period has extended, we've started to increase the number of questions and think about the different things that we can and can't do. So in a way, I see this learning cycle a little bit like when you're playing Jenga. Do you know that game where you're putting blocks one on top of the other? And when you pull out a block and put it on top of the pile, you don't just throw it on. You put it on gently, and then you take your hand away, see what response there is. Then you move it slightly and adjust to make sure that the tower is eventually balanced. That's really the point here of that learning cycle. It's to really get an understanding. We're constantly striving to get out of that state of disequilibrium because that disequilibrium makes us feel a little bit frustrated. Moving on to think about questions, and it might seem like a very obvious question from me is, the questions that we ask in the classroom. How do we use questions? Why do we use questions? Well, I've put in a couple here that I've picked up. I'm sure you have more suggestions, and I'd love to hear what they are. But one of the reasons why we ask questions is the classic teacher thing of classroom management. So as teachers, we look around our class and we know who's paying attention, who's not paying attention, who's falling asleep, who's falling behind, who's engaged, who's not engaged. And so our questions are designed to bring people in so that they're all part of that learning experience and to keep our students on their toes. We might ask questions as well in an attempt to focus attention. So as the teacher, we have an idea of the learning principles, the learning guidance of where we want to get to in the lesson. And so we'll ask questions in order to guide our students down a particular path. So for example, if you're reading a story or if you're analyzing a story, you might ask questions such as, who is the narrator? We'll also ask questions that encourage formative assessment or to check understanding, a little bit like the classroom management. But these are the ones where we're looking around our students and we're seeing whether they're understanding, not understanding, whether it's too easy, whether it's too difficult, all those kind of questions. And we're adjusting our teaching constantly in relation to the response that we're getting from our students. And then we'll also ask questions that stimulate thinking. So these are the big, what do you think questions, or how do you think that type questions. If we're looking at Bloom's taxonomy, these would be the ones that are in the create, evaluate sections. Now, there was some research done, well, there's lots of research done about the kind of questions that teachers ask and the quantity of questions that teachers ask. And there's one piece of research that suggests that in a lesson, an average teacher can ask round about 50 questions, which is a lot. A lot of them are going to be the classroom management. Very few of them are going to be the kind of stimulate thinking type of questions. But that's fine, because the stimulate thinking questions are big questions that take time. Now, this one as well might seem like a slightly silly question. Let's flip in the idea. Why do our learners ask us questions? And again, I've put down just a couple of suggestions here, and I'm sure you have a lot more ideas as well. But there's the idea where they are checking understanding. They're not completely sure, or they just want that reassurance from you that what they've understood is correct, whatever correct might mean. And these are the ones where, perhaps we need to be a little bit careful of these, because we can sometimes provide too much security. And there is some research, in fact, as well from that suggests that if teachers ask too many questions, then we're providing too much security for our learners, because they know that the teacher is going to guide them down the correct path. So they don't need to engage cognitively as much as perhaps they would otherwise. Sometimes teachers, it's not teachers, students sometimes ask questions just to show off, just to sort of say, look, I know this, I'm with you, I understand. And that's good, that's a nice thing, or it can be a nice thing. When students ask us questions in the classroom, it shows an active participation. It shows it's contributing to that idea of the classroom community. And sometimes, or very often, the key ones here are the questions that students ask that denotes or that demonstrates curiosity. Going back to that research that suggested that a teacher can ask around about 50 questions in a lesson, that same research suggested that if a teacher asked around 50 questions, a student might ask only 1 or 2 questions in a lesson. And we can understand why that is. There are pressures on us as teachers. We have to get through the curriculum, we have to finish the book, we have to prepare for the assessment, we have to do this, we have to do the other. We're balancing and juggling a lot of things. So it's obvious that we have to maintain control and keep the class in sync as much as possible. But I think it's also useful to reflect a little bit and ask ourselves whether we are providing enough opportunities for our students to be asking us questions that demonstrate their curiosity. Because again, it's through the curiosity that the learning happens. And if we think particularly about some of our very younger learners, so if we're thinking about preschool students, I'm sure it's happened to you that they'll be full of questions. So they might ask, why is the sky blue? Why is the sea green? Do dogs laugh? All sorts of random questions. But often you have to capture them in the moment. if you wait, if you delay responding to that question, very often they might just go off and think about different things and go off on a different train of thought. Now, this is in no way to suggest that what we're doing now is wrong. It's simply kind of a reflection of our reality. And I think what is a useful thing to do is to think about the questions that we're asking. So next time we're in front of the class, whether it be virtually through Zoom or whether it be in reality, is to really just make a note perhaps of the kind of questions that we're asking as we're teaching. Because I think the key thing here, the key point that I want to emphasize, is we need to be asking ourselves, do we think of ourselves as a kind of Google, or do we think of ourselves as a bit more of a treasure map? And by that I mean, when a student asks us a question, do we just reply immediately? Or do we sometimes provide the path for our students to find the answer for themselves? Do we provide them the clues for them to answer? And it will depend on the situation. Some questions, as a teacher, you'll know when you need to give a clear, precise answer. And sometimes you'll know when you can be a little bit more playful and encourage the student to think for themselves. So, for example, if I were to ask you for the Wi-Fi code, I don't want a long treasure hunt. I just want you to give me the numbers. So it's a case that obviously needs to be some kind of rationalization process as well. Moving on to ambiguity. Now, this is a slightly strange example. I hope it works for you. It works in my own little mind, but it's my job to make sure I can translate it to you as well. Ambiguity, what is it? I think recently, before Christmas, I was doing some work and I was having to travel around various cities, and every day was a different city, different hotel. So you know what it's like. You get into the hotel, you're tired, you've been traveling all day, and you just want to have a wash, brush your teeth, have a rest, have some food, and go to bed. I arrived at this hotel, and I only had 5 minutes because then I had to go down for a meeting. So I thought, okay, I want to brush my teeth. Nice and simple, you'd think. So I went to the bathroom and I saw everything was there, very nice bathroom, and I saw the tap, but I didn't know how to turn on the tap. So that was a little bit annoying. So I thought maybe it had a sensor. So I was waving my hand underneath. I couldn't get it to work. I banged the top of the tap just in case there was some kind of other sensor there. Maybe the front of the sink. I looked on the floor to see if there were any buttons, any pedals. I couldn't work it out. I had no idea how to turn on the water. As I say, I didn't have very long, so I ended up brushing my teeth in the shower, which is a slightly strange experience. But anyway, I finished my meeting, I come back to my room and I think, okay, I want to find out. I want to know where the taps are. And eventually I discovered them after another 5 minutes of searching. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see the sink and the wall. And you can see there's a very small space, and the taps were actually in that space. Okay, so, all right, it's a very silly example. But the point is, I arrived in my room and I was feeling anxious, frustrated, tired. I wanted to brush my teeth. Something that was so simple, something that I didn't need to think about normally, I was suddenly pushed out of my comfort zone and I had to think of another solution, another way of finding a solution. And again, I emphasize, this is the point. A position of ambiguity is not necessarily one that we find enjoyable. It can be frustrating. It can be irritating. But look, it's given me an anecdote to use in presentations. So there are benefits to these situations, and obviously these all lead to the learning opportunities as well. So ambiguity is about so many things. Thinking about it also from a language learning perspective, ambiguity is about having multiple meanings, where it could mean this, it could mean that. Ambiguity is about being not particularly clear about things. Ambiguity is about things where you're talking about things that might happen or that might be true. You're working with very limited information. So that's, again, a key factor. And there's lots of uncertainty. You don't know if what you're doing is right or if it's wrong. There's multiple contradictions. So within this context, and this, let's face it, this is our life today. Our lives are filled with ambiguity. And the fact is, we can't eliminate ambiguity. So we have to learn to live with it and enjoy the process and the learning that it offers. Looking at ambiguity from an evolutionary perspective, and again, this one's a slightly strange one, so I hope it makes sense to you. Um, I'm a creature of habit. I have my routines and I stick to my routines all the time. So, for example, every morning I wake up, first thing I do is I make myself a cup of coffee, orange juice, and I go up and do some work for a little bit. And then I take the dog out for a walk. Okay, I do that every day. I don't think about it. I just do it. But imagine a hypothetical situation where one day I get up, I get the dog ready to take the dog out for a walk. I open the door, and behind the door, there's a big, hungry, angry lion waiting for me. Admittedly, the lion in the picture doesn't look particularly hungry or particularly angry, but that's because of artistic limitations more than anything else. But it forces me out of my comfort zone. I can't just say, "Oh, excuse me, I need to take the dog out." I can't rationalize with I can't be rational with a lion. So I have to think about it. I'm forced out of my comfort zone. I'm forced into action. And this is the key thing. The point is, we like our routines, we like our habits, we like our cliches because our brains are very energy hungry. They consume a lot of glucose specifically as well. So whenever we are engaged in cognitive action, we are consuming energy. So from an evolutionary perspective, the brain does everything within its power to conserve as much energy as possible. And there was some research a little while ago, which you might have seen because it was on the news and in the papers. A professor at Stanford University, he did some research with some grandmaster chess players, and he was looking at the amount of calories that they consumed. And he estimated that grandmaster chess players can consume between 6,000 and 7,000 calories every single day just by sitting playing chess. But that's simply because their brains are in action, are moving. So the point is that we need to physically I say, we need to make a deliberate attempt to engage our cognitive ability, to engage our action, to engage our brains. I think after this situation, this lockdown period is over, there's going to be a lot of research that's going to come out. But going back to 2014 here in London, there was some research that was done on the London Underground. There was a strike that lasted for 3 days. And so the people that commuted in London were forced to use a different route. So they couldn't use the tube. So some people walked, some people got the bike, some people got a bus, different things. Anyway, the strike finished, people went back to their normal habits. But researchers analysed the trips that these people were taking, and they realised that a significant period of time after the strike, 1 in 20 people had permanently changed their commute. And that's the point. If there had been no strike, they would have continued their normal commute. The fact is, something happened that forced them into a position of discomfort where they had to reevaluate their everyday situations. So moving on again, and this time thinking about children specifically. We sometimes hear that children don't like ambiguity. I really don't agree with that. I think children need security, absolutely. Children need love, affection. They need a home. They need food. They need shelter. All these sorts of things. I don't have an argument with those. But I think we only need to look at any children's book or any children's film, and we can see that there's a complete mixture and integration of reality and fiction. I mean, you only need to look at the story of Pinocchio. I can't remember the details now, but just the basic information is a puppet maker makes a puppet, the puppet comes to life, but it's still a puppet. The puppet wants to become a human. And so the puppet goes to school. He goes to school with other children, but he's still a puppet. His nose grows longer, and he also, at some point, he goes off to Pleasure Island. So the wooden puppet becomes half donkey, and then the half donkey gets swallowed by a whale, and then he meets father, and then he turns into a real. It's complete madness. But children don't have a problem with that. They don't really say, okay, which bit is real, which bit is not real. So maybe the point is that one question that we should be asking ourselves as teachers is, are we providing too much certainty in the classroom? Because there was a quote that I heard on the radio a little while ago. I can't remember who said it, but he was talking about education, and he was talking about the poison of the right answer culture. And this idea that perhaps we're offering too much black, white, right, wrong, true, false. So my argument is, and something that we need to be exploring, is not to completely unsettle children and make them feel constantly and ill at ease, but to just occasionally teach them that life really is, there is no certainty in life. There's no point in perpetuating the idea that there is certainty. And the fact is that children are navigating through these situations that are mixed with reality and fiction. They don't have a problem with ambiguity. So we as teachers should be building on that. And then thinking a little bit more about ambiguity in a learning context, particularly if we consider, for example, a language learning context. Now, I'm sure your English is brilliant, it's marvelous, but if you come to the UK or go to the US or wherever it might be, I'm sure there are times where you are in a shop or you're in a social situation and you're not 100% certain about what's going on. Maybe it's because of the traditions, maybe it's because of the dialect, maybe it's because of 1,000 different things. Even in your own country, if you go to another region, I'm sure there's always going to be something, a little bit of vocabulary, a little bit of a tradition, a custom, something that is not quite as you would expect it to be. And that's when you are in a position of ambiguity. That's when you are forced into a position of disequilibrium where you have to start the learning cycle. And let's face it, learning a language, however, despite what we're trying to do, learning a language is non-linear. Learning a language is very messy. Learning a language is about going backwards and forwards, and it can be very, very confusing. Which is why we need our learners to be, as Angela Duckworth and Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck did the work on the growth mindset. Angela Duckworth did the work on the resilience and perseverance and grit. And that's the thing with learning as well. We need to be resilient. So when we go and try to brush our teeth and we can't, we need to be resilient. We need to persevere to find out how to turn on the water. Again, it's a silly example, but I hope you take my point. Whenever we're in a learning situation, we're forced out of our comfort zones, and we need to make sure that we're persevering, that we're pushing through the ambiguity to find some new learning, and we can begin a new learning cycle. So that's a very brief overview. We looked at the idea of questions. We looked at the questions that students ask us. We considered a little bit about our role in answering questions, whether we are more Google or whether we are more like a treasure map, whether we're providing answers quickly or whether we are sort of helping our students find their own answers. And so just to end off, I wanted to go through 2 or 3 ideas here that I'd written down. And again, I'm sure you have lots of other ideas as well that I'd love to hear. And these suggestions are not things that are changing your teaching practice fundamentally. I'm sure they're things that you do already, but I think they're useful to reevaluate within the context of deliberately creating a little bit more ambiguity in the classroom. So, for example, when a student asks us a question, depending on the question, of course, it's sometimes fun, interesting, annoying to throw it back to the student and say, okay, you tell me, what do you think? Forcing them to think, forcing them into a situation where they're having to engage cognitively with the process. Because I think, as you know as teachers and as parents, you know that students learn very quickly what will make you happy. So they know the answers to give you, the things to say that will require the least amount of effort from them cognitively, but that will get you off their backs, to put it nicely. So when they suddenly realize that you're not going to give up, you're going to be a little bit like a dog with a bone, you're going to persevere, you're going to expect more from your students, then they are going to in turn have to engage a little bit more cognitively and think a little bit harder. Excuse me 1 second. Another technique, there was some research that was done a little while ago, but the researcher was looking at, well, she analysed hours and hours and hours and hours of classroom footage. And what she realised was that when a teacher asks a lower order thinking question, so I don't know, what's the answer to number 3? If she waited for a period of around 3 seconds, then the quality of the responses improved. And what was interesting was that if she asked a higher order thinking question, something along the lines of, why do you think that? And waited for a period of around 10 seconds, then again, the quality of the responses got better. And this is a technique that I'm sure they taught that you use or that you did at teacher training college. It's a tried and tested technique. But sometimes I think we get into bad habits and we sometimes are afraid of silence. So that awkward silence that's forcing people to engage, to think, I think is a very valuable tool that we can explore as and when to use. Again, I'm not saying that we use it all the time, but I think very quickly our learners will understand that you are expecting more from them and you are pushing them a little bit harder. Another option might be to just kind of be a little bit annoying. So kind of shrug your shoulders and say, don't know, you tell me. A little bit like number 1, but again, just to push the expectation back on the learner so that they can start challenging themselves to think, okay, I've got all the information I need. I can do this. One that I think is really, really important is the idea that we all too often, not only do we do black, white, right, wrong, true, false, but we also assume there is one correct answer. And there's an expression in English, I don't know if you know it, that there's more than one way to skin a cat, which is a bit of a strange, awkward, horrible expression. But anyway, but it's very useful in that just to get the sense that there are always options, there are always alternatives. There may be a single correct answer, possibly, but it's good to explore the idea of alternatives or possibilities within a context. Also, and sometimes these are dismissed, but getting your students to think of a sensible answer and a silly answer. Now, remember, in the creative process, that generation of randomness can actually be the beginning of a valid, interesting, creative idea. So we shouldn't dismiss things that might seemingly seem silly. So really, that's kind of a very general overview of the point I was trying to make. I think really what I'm trying to encourage is not all the time, just every now and then, start to train your students to expect you to be a little, for them to expect, sorry, let me get this right, for you to expect from them a little bit more. So push your students that little bit harder and getting them to feel, to take a little bit more autonomy, to become a little bit more self-directed by using the idea of ambiguity. And remembering that ambiguity is that state where it does make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it is something that is good and is a critical part of the learning process. Okay, so that's more or less everything that I had to say today. I did have this slide as a kind of summary, but I think it now might be a good time, if anybody has any comments or any questions, then maybe it's a good time to do that.
Thanks, Paul. So that was really great. Just while everyone's getting their ideas together, I have a question, and it's to do with your image there with Google and a map. So I was wondering what you thought the effect of all this instant information was on creativity, because I can think, oh, why is the sky blue, and I can just look it up straight away and have the answer, and that might inspire me to ask more questions. But I definitely miss out on that kind of, oh, I wonder why the sky is blue kind of moment. What do you think the net effect is of all that info?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is something that I wrestle with because I don't want to seem like a Luddite and say that Google is bad because Google has changed our lives, a lot of it for the better. There's no denying that. And I was in a situation the other day with my own family. There was about, I don't know, 6 or 7 of us around the table, all of us in the same household, I hasten to add. And I can't remember what the question was, but immediately sort of 2 or 3 people went to their phones and 2 or 3 of us said, no, 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 get off your phones. We need to work this out for ourselves. So I really think there's an opportunity for us as teachers to try and introduce that element of criticality into the process. So there's a time and a place for Google, but maybe to make sure that at the beginning we encourage the activation of our brains first, and then we can back it up with Google if necessary. In terms of longitudinally, whether the effect of Google is going to have an impact on us negatively, I think that's an interesting area, and I think there's a lot of research, but I wouldn't like to comment specifically.
Well, I'm just trying to see if there's any questions in the chat. A lot of people saying hello.
Hello.
No, I don't. I don't. Oh, there we go. There's one. Just bang on time. Okay, so in my experience as a secondary English teacher, sometimes it happens that there might be more than one right answer.
And Andres is still typing as we think that is sometimes shocking for them. Ah, interesting. I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it's whether it's the case that we as teachers have conditioned them to expect there to be one right answer. That's debatable. You know, there's multiple reasons why it happens. I think as our learners are younger, certainly in primary, in preschool, their synaptic connections, they've got so many more synaptic connections. And as they get older, they start to lose more of those synaptic connections because they've established the requirements. But the wonderful thing about preschool and primary is that they're open to every new experience. So that's our window of opportunity to really get in there and to challenge them and to make sure that we expect them to retain as many of those synaptic connections as possible.
A couple of comments from Sonia and from Yolanda, and they're along the lines that really that teenagers get a little bit frustrated with ambiguity, and how can we maybe deal with that a little bit?
Completely. And some learners will get much more frustrated than others, but I think that's just part of the process. And I think the earlier we begin, and obviously I was thinking primarily about preschool and primary, but still it's absolutely relevant in secondary. But if it's a process that we can begin as early as possible, when they get to you in secondary, then they're going to be much more tolerant of ambiguity and much more prepared to accept the fact that there might be some multiple answers. But I think even with secondary students, and it's a long-term game, it's not going to happen immediately. You're not over one lesson, it's not going to change. It's going to take time. And I think it's just a case of doing sort of little by little. And eventually they'll understand that if certainly a lot of learners will ask very obvious questions. And those are the ones that you can really throw back to them and say, you know, come on, you know the answer to that one. You tell me. Or, you know, maybe get somebody else to help out or something like this. But just that idea of holding back a little bit more and not being very fast to kind of provide the answer. Even if we are going to provide the answer, maybe just to wait that 10 seconds, for example. That makes that feel a little bit unsure, insecure, uncomfortable, but it's good as part of the process.
A few people saying the same, that like not just teenagers, like primary adults, that like nobody's really comfortable with ambiguity. But maybe it's what you're saying, right? That it's a process and it's not looking for overnight change. Just you know, starting the process of increasing comfort with it.
And we've seen it. I mean,
okay, I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry, Neil. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, you please.
No, I think, I mean, the situation, again, as I say, I don't really want to use reality too much because we've had enough of reality, but the situation we're in shows us that we have no choice. We have to learn to expect the unexpected. It's impossible to ever say that we know what's going to happen in the future. So it's our responsibility as parents, as teachers, as educators to get that into our students. whether or not they like it. And Neil, I'm not sure if you're still there, but I'm looking at some of the chats, and from Enrique, students always need to get to the point and a clear and concise answer. I would throw that back and I'd say that I think that's true. We all want clear, concise answers, but the point is that they're not necessarily going to always be forthcoming. So when you as the teacher is not there, when they go into their university and they need to do their own research, when they go into a job and they say, okay, here's the project, find all the answers, it's a life skill. So I think the more that we can do at the beginning, the better it's going to be for them in the long term, because I think I would like to see ambiguity as a life skill.
I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. They can't expect to have all the correct answers going through their life all the way. Absolutely. Okay, well, Paul, look, I think we're going to leave it there because we're going to move on and get things ready for the next speaker. But again, thank you very much. Really very interesting. I'm sure everyone really got a lot out of it. Oh, yes, there's you want to give your website?
Yeah, no, and there's lots of questions, and I can see some people have more questions. So please feel free if you have any more questions, or as I say, if you just want to shout at me, that's absolutely fine. Send me an email, and I'll happily respond. But again, thank you to everybody for today, and thank you to Neil and Monse for setting this up.
Right, okay, thanks, Paul. Yeah, and you have Paul's website there, nurturingcreativity.org, and you have his email, so make sure you send him any emails of any questions that you have left. All right, well, thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy.